Hi guys, in this video we're starting a series on JavaScript game development. Before we get started, some requirements. Three of them: a text editor, a browser, and basic knowledge about JavaScript, HTML. Alright, so starting out, we're going to create our initial index.html file, any HTML file that you can run with a browser. We're going to start out by telling the browser what kind of file we're using. Basic stuff you'll use in any HTML file, and basic HTML body tags. Okay, so we're going to be using a new tag that some of you might be familiar with, some of you might not. It's the canvas tag. And basically, the way this works is JavaScript can draw on it just like a canvas in real life. And they use it to make games, animations, and things that would usually replace Adobe Flash or Java or anything external. Alright, so we're going to be using just three attributes right now. The ID, we're just going to call it canvas. Width, I'm going to set to 500 for now. You can set it to whatever you want. Alright, so in our body tag, below our canvas, we're going to link our script. And we're going to name our script canvas, because what we're doing with it is initiating the canvas and returning methods to use to draw on the canvas. So got that linked. Let's go ahead and create the file. Okay, so in our canvas.js file, we're going to start out initiating the canvas. We're going to be using the getContext method, and basic example of this method in use is this. Okay, so basically telling the browser we're using a 2D canvas, and we're calling it on this reference from the document object model, and everything is going to the context variable. Now we have methods that we can use for drawing on the canvas. So for example, we're going to begin the path. We always want to call begin path method before we start drawing on the canvas. I'm going to make a rectangle. Let me model what this looks like. So we're giving it 4 arguments: X position, Y position, width, and height. So I'm going to put it 0, 0, 50 wide, 50 high. This is telling the browser what we're going to draw, and then now we're going to fill it. The basic fill style default is black. Now we have a black rectangle on the canvas. Alright, so that was a great example of what you can do with JavaScript HTML5 canvas. Now we're going to look behind the scenes at what I just did. The code that I just showed you may look like clean code, but it's not. Using the basic idea of encapsulation, we're going to split up what I just did into various parts, and we can then access them individually as needed. So I'm going to make an object called context. I'm going to put 2 properties in this object. One of them is canvas. I'm going to set that to null. Context, set it to null as well. And create is going to write to those properties. So we're going to take an argument, canvas tag ID, and we're going to say this.canvas. We're going to set this to, we're going to reference the document object model and then save that to the property. So this.canvas is document.getElement by ID, canvas tag ID. So what we've just done here is made a function that, instead of specifically calling the canvas tag in getContext, what we're doing is making a method that we can call on multiple canvases if we wanted to, and also it splits it up into canvas and context properties. Next thing we're going to do is set the context property to this.canvas.get context, and we're using a 2D canvas. Now that we have this create method created, we're going to call it, and we're going to use the canvas tag. So this is saying the element with the ID of canvas. That's what we're using in referencing from the DOM, and we're calling it get context. So now what we can do is, instead of using context.beginPath, context.rectangle, context.whatever, we're going to make kind of a shorthand called CTX. I'm going to be using CTX to pretty much do everything in drawing on the canvas, and it has all the methods that we're going to be using. So to do that, we're going to do CTX equals context.context. The next thing I'm going to do is separate my JavaScript files into two pieces this time. I'm going to have the canvas and game.js. Game.js we're going to be using for the game loop and animating on the canvas. So note, game.js is going to be linked below canvas.js. That's very important. So you don't have canvas.js before game.js. Game.js is not going to work because you don't have the methods yet to draw on the canvas. First thing we're going to do is make the game loop. The way a lot of people do it is make a set interval function that basically for every frame, so you have maybe 30 frames per second, 60 frames per second, for every frame it's going to do something on the canvas. What I do is let the browser optimize, and you'll see that it's actually a lot smoother than doing it yourself. The way we do that is make a game loop. Basically what the game loop is a loop that you run your game with. Every video game that you play has a loop. Otherwise the game would just end and that'll be the end of the game. The way you can keep playing a game is it has a loop that checks for user input and then updates every frame. So I'm going to define a function called game loop and run it. The reason we're not using a self-running function, something like this, is because this is within its own scope. And so the reason we're doing that is we have a window.request animation frame that creates the loop. So if we had a self-running function, since this takes the parameter game loop, we wouldn't be able to reference it even from itself because this is within the window object. Actually, just for fun, let's see what happens if we use this self-running function. Okay, so basically I have this game loop and it draws a rectangle each time. Let's see what happens. So we got nothing. The console says failed to execute because callback provided as parameter 1 is not a function. If we look at parameter 1 game loop, it's because this is a self-running function within its own scope. So we're going to go back to defining a function that's not self-running. Within this function, this loop, we're going to make a rectangle. All right. So the next thing we're going to do is ask for user input. The first thing we have to do before we can actually use user input is have a place to store it. So before game.js, we're going to create yet another JavaScript file called player.js. And the purpose for player.js is to store all the player's data and have methods within the player object that we can call from the game loop. So player.js, we're going to make a object called player. And this is going to have a couple properties, x, y, and player.draw. Going to be a function. This is what our object is going to look like. And we're going to make a class with a constructor that we can actually make functionality and have a constructor that will make this object. So let's make an object. Let's make a class called player. I have a constructor that has this.x equals. Basically what I did here is took math.random up to the width of the canvas, and we round that to the nearest integer. The reason I'm doing that is to make the player, the rectangle in this case, appear on a random place in the screen. So that's the x coordinate. I'm going to do the same with the y coordinate. Perfect. The reason we're using constructors, we can do stuff like this functionality. Now we're going to make a method within our player called draw. I'm going to draw the player. You gotta stop. Begin path. And we're going to draw the rectangle at this dot x, this dot y, and it's going to have width of 50, height of 50. And we can go ctx.fill. Now all that's left to do is make this into an object. Alright, so now we have this player object, player, and within our game loop, now we don't have to use this. Now we can go player dot draw. And now we are drawing the player. So you can see the player is appearing on a random spot on the screen every time we reload. Alright, so within this player.draw method, we're going to do some interesting stuff. First of all, we're going to ask for input from the client. And the way we're going to do that is make a new file. The reason we're making a whole bunch of files is encapsulation, and in programming is very important. We're going to make a new file called keyboard.js. I'm going to link that at the bottom. So within this keyboard.js file, first of all, we're going to make event listeners, and that's within the window object. So we're going to add an event listener, and it's going to be key down. I'm going to link it to key down function, key up. I'm going to link that to the key up function. So now we're going to find these functions, key down and key up. So essentially what these event listeners do is whatever the key down or key up event is called, it passes a parameter called event to these functions. And in these functions, first of all, we're going to define the function. So we have key down, and it takes the event parameter, and key up. And following a principle called the dry principle, don't repeat yourself, we're actually going to make a new function. It seems kind of redundant, but you'll see what I'm doing. And we're going to take two parameters, the event and boolean, but we're getting ahead of ourselves. So first of all, in the key down, we're going to say, let's say key press, event, and true. The reason we're saying true is the boolean value for pressing a key down is true. It means we're pressing the key down. Key up, we're going to use the same thing, but we're going to say false. That way, we're going to have a switch case for each key in our key press function, and the boolean value is going to determine if the key is pressed up or pressed down. It's going to have an object called key, and we have W, false, A, false, S, false, D, false. Alright, so commented out I have the corresponding key codes to each key. I've linked in the description to a key code listener that tells you which key code is the one you're pressing. An easy way to replicate that is to do alert event.keycode, and each time you press a key, it's going to tell you which key you're pressing. So now we're going to make our switch case. So we're switching on event.keycode, and we're going to do case 87. Key dot w equals boolean. So that's where this bool is coming in here. If you're wondering about that, it's going to set it to either true or false based on if you're pressing down or pressing up. Alright, so we have our key press functions. Everything here is done for W, A, S, and D for controlling your player. Basically now, all we have to do is reference that from our player.js. For each loop in the game loop, we're playing the player.call function. Inside this function, you can have a few if statements. So if key.w, player.y minus equals player dot equals this dot speed, and I'm using this dot speed here. We are actually going to set that, and we're going to set it to 10. So our player should be going 10 pixels each game loop, and the game loop is defined by the browser in this case. Alright, so we have our if statements completed. Now all is left to do is run the code, and now you can see when we press our keys, it moves the block around. But we have a problem. We're not clearing the canvas each time you run it, and this can be used to make a simple drawing application or something like that. In this case, this is not what we want to do. So all you have to do is clear the canvas, and we have a awesome little method we can use in our game loop. So the method we're going to be using is clear rect, and we're going to set to 0.0 canvas.width and canvas.height, and that just clears the canvas. Alright, that concludes our video. Stay tuned for the next video as we go over drawing images and sprites on your canvas.